What happens when the galaxy's most prestigious governing body makes the worst mistake in cosmic history?
When the Galactic Assembly cast humanity out into the void, they thought they were ridding themselves of a troublesome, primitive species. They believed humans were too violent, too unpredictable, too dangerous to remain among civilized worlds. They were right about one thing: humans were dangerous.
But not in the way they thought.
While the Assembly's 1,000-member species continued their endless debates and political games, something extraordinary was happening in the dark corners of space where humanity had been banished. Cut off from galactic trade routes, denied access to established technologies, and left to survive on their own, humans did what they do best: they adapted, they innovated, and they built something the galaxy had never seen before. 20 years after their exile, when the Assembly faces an existential threat that their combined fleets cannot handle, they will discover that the species they cast out has become something far more powerful than they ever imagined.
And humanity remembers exactly how they were treated.
Sometimes the greatest mistake is not recognizing strength until it's too late to ask for mercy. The chamber fell silent as High Counselor Vexthera raised her crystalline appendage, casting prismatic light across the assembled delegates. 2,000 species from across the galaxy had gathered for this moment, their representatives filling the massive amphitheater that orbited the neutral moon of Charis Prime. The decision they were about to make would echo through history, though none of them could imagine just how profoundly. "The motion before us is clear," Vexthera announced, her voice carrying the authority of 3 millennia in galactic politics. Species designation 7 Alpha Tau, commonly known as humanity, has violated no fewer than 47 interstellar accords in the past decade alone. Their aggressive expansion, their refusal to accept our guidance, and their disturbing tendency toward violence makes them unfit for continued membership in our assembly. Admiral Sarah Chen sat in the human delegation's designated area, her jaw clenched as she watched centuries of diplomatic work crumble around her. Beside her, Ambassador Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, while Dr. Elizabeth Hayes gripped her datapad so tightly her knuckles had turned white. They had come here hoping to defend humanity's actions, to explain the context behind each supposed violation. Now they realized this wasn't a trial, it was an execution. The Zephyrian delegate stood first, his tall, ethereal form seeming to float above his speaking platform. The humans claimed they were defending themselves when they destroyed the Graktor mining stations near Jupiter.
But investigation shows they used weapons of unprecedented destruction.
Antimatter warheads that left nothing but empty space where once stood facilities housing thousands of beings. Those mining stations were illegally extracting resources from our solar system, Admiral Chen interjected, rising to her feet. They refused to cease operations despite repeated warnings, and, when they began targeting Earth's moon, we had no choice but, "You had the choice to bring the matter before this assembly," interrupted the hegemony representative, a massive, slug-like creature whose translator rendered his thoughts into perfect galactic standard.
"Instead, you acted unilaterally, with typical human arrogance."
Dr. Hayes stood now, her voice cutting through the murmurs of agreement rippling through the chamber. "With respect, Counselor Melig, your own records show it takes an average of 14 years for territorial disputes to be resolved through assembly channels.
The Graktor were strip mining our moon. Earth's tides were beginning to destabilize.
We couldn't wait 14 years for you to reach a decision."
The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. It was true, and everyone knew it.
The Galactic Assembly's bureaucratic processes moved at glacial speed, designed for species that thought in terms of centuries rather than decades.
Humanity's brief lifespan made them impatient, desperate for quick solutions to immediate problems.
This fundamental difference had been the source of friction since humanity's admission to the Assembly 50 years earlier. Vexthera's colors shifted to deeper purples, a sign of growing irritation. The humans consistently demonstrate their inability to function within civilized galactic society.
The Proxima Incident.
The trade war with the Stellar Confederacy.
The unauthorized colonization of 17 systems that were clearly marked as preservation zones.
Empty systems, Ambassador Rodriguez said quietly, but his words carried clearly through the chamber's acoustics. 17 empty systems that had been preserved for over 800 years while billions of humans lived in overcrowded conditions on Earth and Mars.
We sent survey teams.
We confirmed no intelligent life existed in those systems.
We even offered to share the resources with any assembly member who wished to establish joint colonies.
The preservation zones exist for important ecological reasons, the Verdani delegate rustled, her tree-like form swaying with emotional disturbance. Your species lacks the patience to understand the delicate balance of galactic conservation.
Sarah Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach.
She had served in 3 wars, faced down alien battlecruisers with nothing but determination and human stubbornness, but she had never felt as helpless as she did in this moment.
They weren't here to present humanity's case.
They were here to witness humanity's sentencing. The debate continued for hours, but the outcome had been predetermined. Speaker after speaker rose to catalog humanity's crimes, real and imagined.
The unauthorized development of quantum weaponry. The establishment of independent trade routes that bypassed assembly oversight.
The creation of military alliances with non-assembly species. Each accusation painted humanity as a rogue element, too dangerous and unpredictable to remain within civilized galactic society. When the final vote was called, the result was overwhelming: 1,847 in favor of expulsion, 127 against, with 26 abstentions. The human delegation sat in stunned silence as the numbers appeared on the great display above them. By the authority vested in this assembly by the Treaty of Galactic Unity, Vexthera intoned, Species 7 Alpha Tau is hereby expelled from membership. All trade agreements are dissolved.
All technological sharing agreements are terminated.
All human vessels have 90 days to depart assembly space. Any human found within our territories after this grace period will be considered a hostile intruder. The chamber erupted in a mixture of applause and protests.
Some species celebrated what they saw as the removal of a dangerous element from galactic politics.
Others, particularly those who had worked closely with humans, voiced their disapproval. The Centauri delegation walked out in protest.
The Free Traders Union representative declared the decision short-sighted and economically devastating.
But the majority had spoken, and the galaxy's most advanced democratic institution had rendered its verdict. Admiral Chen stood slowly, her expression carefully neutral despite the rage burning in her chest. She had fought in the Titan War, where human forces had saved 3 assembly worlds from Devonian conquest. She had commanded the rescue fleet that evacuated 2 million civilians from the Kepler Prime disaster. She had dedicated her entire career to proving that humanity deserved its place among the stars. All of it, apparently, meant nothing. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly, her words somehow carrying to every corner of the vast chamber.
Humanity has made errors, yes.
We've acted hastily sometimes, aggressively when we felt threatened. But we've also saved lives, protected the innocent, and stood against tyranny whenever we encountered it. We've been good allies to those who accepted us as partners rather than treating us as children to be managed. Vexthera's colors shifted to cold blues and grays. Your species will have ample opportunity to prove its worth in isolation, Admiral.
Perhaps exile will teach humanity the wisdom that membership in our assembly could not.
Sarah Chen looked around the chamber one last time, memorizing the faces of those who had voted to cast humanity into the void.
Some looked smug, others relieved, a few genuinely sad.
She wondered if any of them would remember this moment when they realized what they had done.
"Perhaps it will," she said simply, then turned and walked toward the exit, followed by the rest of the human delegation.
Behind them, the assembly continued its business, already moving on to the next item on their agenda as if they hadn't just altered the course of galactic history. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, during which the human delegation sat in contemplative silence. Admiral Chen spent hours staring out at the stars, wondering what would happen to the colonies, to the millions of humans scattered across assembly space, to the relationships they had built with other species over 5 decades of membership. When they finally arrived at Earth, the news had already spread.
Protests filled the streets of every major city. Some demanded immediate military action against the assembly. Others called for complete withdrawal from galactic affairs. Politicians gave speeches about human dignity and independence.
Scientists worried about the loss of technological exchanges that had accelerated human development by centuries. In the quiet of her office overlooking Lake Geneva, Dr. Hayes compiled her final report on humanity's expulsion from the Galactic Assembly. As the chief xenobiologist who had helped negotiate humanity's original membership, she felt personally responsible for this failure. She had believed that given time, the other species would come to appreciate humanity's unique strengths. She had been wrong. But, as she wrote her conclusions, a strange thought occurred to her. Throughout the trial, the Assembly had focused on humanity's violations of their rules, their independence, their refusal to conform to galactic norms. They had treated these traits as weaknesses, as flaws to be corrected.
What if they were actually strengths?
The Assembly species had grown complacent over millennia of peace and prosperity. They followed rules created by their ancestors, rarely questioning whether those rules still made sense. They moved slowly, carefully, always seeking consensus before acting. They had built a civilization of incredible stability and longevity, but also one that had become rigid, bureaucratic, and unable to adapt quickly to new challenges.
Humanity was different. Humans questioned everything, broke rules that didn't make sense, and adapted quickly to changing circumstances.
They had short lives but moved fast, thought creatively, and weren't bound by the weight of ancient traditions.
Maybe exile wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was an opportunity.
Over the following months, as human ships withdrew from Assembly space and human colonists either returned to Earth or chose to relocate to uncontrolled territories, a strange thing began to happen. Instead of collapse, instead of the chaos the Assembly had predicted, humanity began to organize itself in ways that surprised everyone.
The independent human colonies didn't fragment into competing factions.
Instead, they formed the Terran Federation, a loose alliance that maintained Earth as its symbolic heart while allowing each world significant autonomy. Trade agreements were signed not with Assembly oversight, but through direct negotiation between human communities and non-aligned species. Military cooperation developed organically, based on mutual benefit rather than imposed hierarchy.
Most remarkably, scientific development accelerated.
Without Assembly restrictions on dangerous research, human scientists began pursuing avenues of inquiry that had been forbidden for decades.
Quantum mechanics experiments that the Assembly considered too risky. Artificial intelligence research that violated their ethical guidelines. Genetic modification programs that pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be human.
In the Assembly chambers, a few far-sighted delegates began to wonder if they had made a mistake. But the majority remained convinced they had done the right thing. Humanity was unpredictable, potentially dangerous. Better to have them outside the tent than inside, where they could disrupt the careful balance of galactic civilization. They would have reason to reconsider that position sooner than anyone imagined. Captain Marcus Webb stood on the observation deck of the TFS Prometheus, watching the construction crews put finishing touches on humanity's most ambitious project. 15 years had passed since the expulsion, and the view before him would have been impossible to imagine when Admiral Chen had walked out of that Assembly chamber in defeat. The Nexus stretched across 30 cubic kilometers of space, a massive orbital city that served as the heart of the Terran Federation's military and scientific operations. Unlike the sleek, curved designs favored by Assembly species, the Nexus was angular and aggressive, all sharp edges and armored surfaces that spoke to humanity's practical approach to space construction. But it was beautiful in its own way, a testament to what humans could accomplish when they stopped trying to conform to someone else's expectations.
Impressive, isn't it?
Dr. Janet Foster joined Webb at the viewing port, her gray hair reflecting the station's lights. As Director of Advanced Research, she had overseen much of the technological development that made the Nexus possible. When I think about what we were doing 15 years ago, begging the Assembly for permission to research quantum entanglement theory. Webb nodded, remembering those days when human scientists had to submit detailed proposals for every experiment, waiting months or years for approval from committees that rarely understood the research they were reviewing.
And now we have working quantum communicators connecting every human settlement in the galaxy. Real-time communication across thousands of light-years. The Assembly still thinks instantaneous galactic communication is theoretically impossible.
Let them think that, Foster replied with a slight smile.
Their theoretical impossibility is giving us quite an advantage in coordinating fleet movements. Through the Nexus's transparent aluminum windows, they could see the shipyards where humanity's new fleet was taking shape.
These weren't the vessels that had served in the Assembly's exploration missions, designed for peaceful contact and scientific research. These were warships, built with hard lessons learned from humanity's conflicts with species who didn't respect diplomatic solutions. The new destroyers incorporated stealth technology borrowed from humanity's submarine warfare heritage, adapted for space combat. The cruisers featured redundant systems and compartmentalization that would keep them fighting even after sustaining massive damage. The battleships mounted weapons that no assembly species had ever imagined: antimatter torpedoes that could crack a moon, particle beam arrays that could strip the atmosphere from a planet, and quantum disruptors that could tear apart the fabric of spacetime itself.
Any word from the deep reconnaissance teams? Webb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. For the past 5 years, human scouts had been mapping regions of space that the Assembly had declared off-limits or too dangerous to explore. What they had found was disturbing. Reports came in this morning from Sector 447, Foster confirmed, her expression growing serious. The same pattern we've seen in 12 other systems.
Ancient ruins, massive in scope, and all of them showing signs of violent destruction.
Whatever built those structures was incredibly advanced, and whatever destroyed them was even more powerful.
Webb felt a familiar chill run down his spine. The Assembly's map of the galaxy was full of blank spaces, regions they claimed were empty or too hazardous for exploration. Humanity, no longer bound by such restrictions, had begun systematically investigating these areas. What they discovered suggested that the known galaxy was much smaller than anyone realized, surrounded by vast territories where ancient civilizations had flourished and died. The xenoarchaeology team thinks they've identified at least 15 distinct species in those ruins, Foster continued. All extinct, all destroyed within the last 100,000 years.
The weapons' signatures are consistent across all sites. The same enemy destroyed them all? That's what the evidence suggests.
Something with technology far beyond anything we've encountered, something that swept through this entire region of the galaxy and eliminated every trace of intelligent life it found.
Something that the Assembly either doesn't know about, or doesn't want to acknowledge. Webb turned away from the window, processing the implications. Humanity's exile had forced them to explore regions of space that the established galactic powers had ignored or avoided.
In doing so, they had uncovered evidence of a threat that dwarfed any conflict in recorded history.
There's more, Foster said quietly.
The deep space monitoring stations have been picking up anomalous energy readings from beyond the galactic rim.
Patterns that match the weapon signatures from the ruins. The captain's blood turned to ice. How long until whatever's out there reaches inhabited space?
If the patterns hold, and if our calculations are correct, we have maybe 5 years.
Possibly less. Webb was quiet for a long moment, watching the human fleet take shape in the void.
When the Assembly had expelled humanity, they had expected humans to fragment and fade into irrelevance. Instead, adversity had forged them into something stronger.
But, would it be strong enough? A communication alert chimed through the observation deck speakers.
Captain Webb to the command center, the voice announced.
Priority transmission from Earth.
Webb and Foster made their way through the Nexus's corridors, past laboratories where human scientists pursued research that would have horrified the Assembly's ethics committees, past training centers where human Marines practiced combat techniques designed to fight enemies with superior technology, past workshops where engineers built weapons that pushed the boundaries of physics itself. The command center was a hive of activity, with officers coordinating everything from supply runs to distant colonies to intelligence-gathering operations in Assembly space. Despite the official expulsion, humanity maintained extensive covert networks throughout the galaxy, keeping track of political developments and technological advances among their former allies. Admiral Chen appeared on the main display, 15 years older but still carrying herself with the same quiet authority that had impressed even her enemies in the Assembly chamber. She had refused retirement after the expulsion, instead throwing herself into building the Terran Federation's military capabilities. Under her leadership, humanity had gone from a secondary power dependent on alien technology to an independent force that could hold its own against any threat. Marcus, I have news from our intelligence assets in Assembly space, Chen began without preamble.
Something big is happening. Emergency sessions have been called on Kara's Prime.
Military forces throughout the galaxy are being mobilized. And they've put out feelers through diplomatic channels, trying to locate human representatives.
After 15 years of treating us like plague carriers, they suddenly want to talk? Webb couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. It appears so.
Our sources suggest they've detected the same energy anomalies that we've been tracking.
They're scared, Marcus.
For the first time in millennia, the Galactic Assembly is facing a threat they can't handle through committee meetings and diplomatic negotiations.
Foster leaned forward, studying the star charts that accompanied Chen's transmission. Do they know about the ruins? The evidence of the previous extinctions? Unknown.
But, if they're detecting the same energy signatures we are, they know something is coming. Something beyond their ability to comprehend or contain. Webb studied the data flowing across his screens, information gathered by human explorers and scientists working at the edge of known space. The Terran Federation had spent 15 years preparing for threats that the Assembly preferred to ignore.
Now those preparations might be the only thing standing between civilization and annihilation. What are your orders, Admiral? Chen's expression was grim but determined. Continue fleet expansion and training operations.
But also begin contingency planning for possible cooperation with Assembly forces. I know how that sounds after what they did to us, but if our analysis is correct, we're all going to need each other to survive what's coming. The transmission ended, leaving Webb and Foster alone with the weight of impending catastrophe. Through the command center's windows, they could see humanity's fleet continuing its deadly ballet of preparation. Ships that had never existed 15 years ago, technologies that the Assembly still considered impossible, weapons that could reshape the balance of power in the galaxy.
Do you think it's enough? Foster asked quietly. Webb considered the question seriously.
The Terran Federation had approximately 40 million people scattered across hundreds of worlds, compared to the Assembly's trillion-plus population spread across thousands of star systems.
Humanity's technological advantages were significant but limited.
Their military doctrine was sound but untested against the kind of enemy that had wiped out entire galactic civilizations.
I don't know, he admitted.
But, I know this, 15 years ago, we were dependents begging for scraps of technology and permission to exist. Today, we're an independent power with capabilities that would surprise our former allies.
If the Exile taught us anything, it's that humans are at their most dangerous when everyone else counts them out. Over the following weeks, reports from human intelligence networks painted an increasingly desperate picture.
Assembly military forces were mobilizing on a scale not seen since the formation of the galactic government 3,000 years earlier. Emergency meetings were being held between species that had been enemies for centuries.
Ancient defense agreements were being invoked.
Trade routes were being militarized.
The entire structure of galactic civilization was shifting into a wartime footing.
And, still, no official contact had been made with humanity. Webb spent his days overseeing final preparations for the fleet, knowing that time was running short. The energy readings from beyond the galactic rim were growing stronger, more focused. Whatever was out there was getting closer, and it was big enough to threaten everything humanity had ever known.
The irony wasn't lost on him.
The Assembly had expelled humanity because they were too dangerous, too unpredictable, too violent for civilized society. Now, faced with a threat that their civilization couldn't handle, they were discovering that sometimes dangerous, unpredictable, and violent were exactly what survival required. The question was whether they would realize it in time, and whether humanity would be willing to help the species that had cast them into exile. Webb suspected the answer to both questions would determine the fate of every intelligent being in the galaxy. The emergency transmission reached every human outpost simultaneously, carried by quantum communicators across impossible distances in perfect synchronization. Admiral Chen's face appeared on screens throughout the Terran Federation, her expression bearing the weight of the most important decision in human history. Citizens of the Federation, she began, her voice carrying clearly across the vastness of space to colonies that had never heard such words before. 20 minutes ago, I received an official communication from High Counselor Vexthera of the Galactic Assembly. For the first time in 15 years, they have acknowledged our existence. Captain Webb watched from the Nexus Command Center, surrounded by officers who had never served under assembly authority. An entire generation of humans had grown up in exile, knowing the galaxy's major powers only as distant entities that had rejected their species. Now those same powers were asking for help. They call it the Devourers, Chen continued, displaying tactical data that made even experienced military personnel pale.
A technological swarm that has already consumed 17 systems on the galactic rim. Every planet stripped of life, every artificial construct consumed and repurposed, every trace of civilization erased. The Assembly's combined fleets have engaged them 3 times. All 3 engagements ended in complete defeat. The tactical display showed the scope of destruction. Systems that had hosted billions of beings were now empty space, their stars dimmed by massive artificial constructs that harvested stellar energy for unknown purposes. Refugee fleets streamed inward toward the galaxy's core, carrying stories of horror that defy comprehension. The Assembly estimates the Devourers will reach the main inhabited regions in 18 months, Chen said. They have requested immediate military assistance from all independent powers, including the Terran Federation. The decision of whether to respond is mine to make, but the consequences will affect every human in the galaxy. Webb switched channels to monitor reactions from across Federation space. Colony governors debated furiously over open channels. Military commanders analyzed the tactical data with professional detachment. Civilian populations demanded answers to questions no one could answer. Why should humanity risk everything to save the species that had cast them out? What obligation did they have to defend civilizations that had declared them too dangerous for membership in galactic society? Would victory even be possible against an enemy that had effortlessly destroyed the combined might of 2,000 species?
I have made my decision, Chen announced, cutting through the debate with command authority. The Terran Federation will provide military assistance to the Galactic Assembly in the war against the Devourers.
The reaction was immediate and explosive. Some colonies cheered the decision as proof of humanity's nobility. Others condemned it as betrayal of human interests. Military commanders began calculating logistics for the largest deployment in Federation history. Politicians demanded explanations for committing their forces to what looked like a hopeless cause. Webb understood Chen's reasoning, even if he wasn't sure he agreed with it. Humanity couldn't survive alone if the Devourers consumed the rest of the galaxy. Their isolated colonies would eventually be overwhelmed by an enemy that had already proven capable of destroying civilizations far more advanced than the Federation. Better to fight alongside allies, even reluctant ones, than to face extinction alone. The assembly of the human fleet took 2 months, drawing ships from every corner of Federation space. The vessels that gathered at the Nexus staging area represented 15 years of independent human development, technologies and tactics that no assembly species had ever seen. Stealth frigates that could operate undetected in hostile space. Battle cruisers with armor that could withstand direct hits from antimatter weapons. Carriers hosting swarms of automated fighters guided by artificial intelligence systems that the assembly considered abominations. Dr. Foster had worked around the clock to prepare humanity's most advanced weapons for combat deployment. The quantum disruptors have been mounted on every capital ship, she reported to Webb as the fleet prepared to depart. If our theories are correct, they should be effective against the Devourers' energy harvesting systems. But we won't know for certain until we test them in actual combat. And if our theories are wrong? Foster's expression was grim. Then, we'll find out very quickly whether humans are as adaptable in defeat as they are in victory. The journey to the war zone took 3 weeks, during which human ships moved through space that had been forbidden to them for 15 years. Assembly vessels gave them wide berth, unsure how to react to the return of the species they had exiled. Some sent cautious greetings. Others maintained hostile silence. A few attempted to scan the human ships, only to discover that Federation stealth technology made their sensors effectively useless. Webb commanded the Advanced Scout Flotilla, 6 destroyers tasked with reconnaissance ahead of the main fleet. As they approached the battle zone, his sensors began picking up signs of devastation that defied imagination. Entire solar systems had been transformed into industrial complexes, their planet stripped down to bare rock and reformed into geometric structures that served unknown purposes. The Devourers didn't just destroy civilizations, they recycled them into components of their expanding empire. Contact Bearing 27 Mark IV, his tactical officer reported. Multiple vessels, assembly configuration, but the energy signatures are wrong. Webb studied the sensor readings with growing unease. The ships approaching them were clearly of assembly design, but they moved with mechanical precision that suggested automated systems rather than living crews. As they came within visual range, the horrible truth became apparent. The vessels had been consumed and repurposed, their original crews replaced by Devourer technology. Weapon systems had been upgraded with devices that hurt to look at directly. Hull plating had been replaced with materials that seemed to absorb light itself. Command structures had been rebuilt according to alien logic that human minds could barely comprehend. All ships, evasive maneuvers, Webb ordered as the converted vessels opened fire. Deploy countermeasures and return fire at will. The battle was unlike anything in human experience. The Devourer's weapons struck not just at matter and energy, but at the fundamental structures that held reality together. Space itself seemed to buckle and tear under their assault. Several human ships simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but erased as if they had never been built. But humanity's response surprised their enemies. Quantum disruptors tore through Devourer shields like they were made of paper. Antimatter torpedoes found weak points in alien armor that conventional weapons couldn't penetrate. Most importantly, human tactical doctrine proved adaptable to conditions that had paralyzed assembly forces. "They're falling back," Webb's communications officer reported with amazement. "The enemy vessels are actually retreating." For the first time in months of constant defeat, someone had inflicted damage on the Devourer forces and lived to report it. The news spread through the combined fleets like wildfire, providing hope to species that had begun to consider evacuation to other galaxies. The main battle came 2 days later, when the full Devourer fleet emerged from hyperspace near the Cygnus Nebula. Webb watched from his position in the human formation as 2,000 assembly vessels formed their traditional combat configuration, massive ships arranged in geometrically perfect formations that had dominated galactic warfare for millennia. The human fleet deployed differently, their ships scattered in loose formations that seemed almost chaotic by comparison. But Webb knew better. Human military doctrine emphasized flexibility and mutual support over rigid hierarchy. Each ship captain had broad discretion to adapt to changing conditions. Each formation could operate independently if communications were disrupted. Each vessel was designed to continue fighting even after suffering catastrophic damage. The Devourers attacked with overwhelming force, their converted vessels supported by constructs built from the wreckage of consumed civilizations. Energy weapons that could shatter planets struck the combined fleet in coordinated volleys. Reality warping devices created zones where the laws of physics no longer applied. Swarms of automated fighters emerged from carriers the size of moons. The assembly formations began to crumble almost immediately. Their beautiful, symmetrical arrangements became death traps as Devourer weapons targeted command vessels and support systems. Ships that had served faithfully for centuries died in moments, their crews consumed by technologies that treated living beings as raw materials to be processed. But the human ships fought differently. When their formations were disrupted, they adapted instantly. When their command structures were destroyed, junior officers took initiative without waiting for orders. When their weapons proved ineffective, they improvised new tactics on the battlefield. They had learned to be independent during 15 years of exile, and that independence served them well in combat against an enemy that specialized in overwhelming rigid command structures. Webb's destroyer squadron found themselves engaged with a Devourer construct the size of a small moon, its surface bristling with weapons that shouldn't have been able to exist. Conventional tactics would have called for coordinated assault by capital ships. Instead, Webb ordered his vessels to attack individually, using their stealth systems to strike from unexpected angles. "Target the energy collection nodes," he commanded, watching as quantum disruptors tore into alien technology. "If we can disrupt their power systems, the whole construct should become vulnerable." It worked. The massive enemy vessel began to lose cohesion as its energy network failed,
systems shutting down in cascade failures that spread throughout its structure. Within minutes, the seemingly invincible construct was breaking apart, its component systems no longer held together by alien science. Similar scenes played out across the battlefield as human ships demonstrated tactics and technologies that the Devourers hadn't encountered before. Ships that should have been destroyed continued fighting with damaged systems that somehow still functioned.
Weapons that should have been depleted found new sources of ammunition through creative engineering.
Crews that should have been overwhelmed adapted to impossible conditions through sheer human stubbornness. The turning point came when Admiral Chen herself led a strike force directly against the Devourer command vessel, a structure so massive it had its own gravity well. Assembly ships had been unable to even approach it, their weapons useless against shields that drew power from consumed civilizations. But human quantum technology operated on principles that the Devourers hadn't accounted for.
All ships, target the central core, Chen commanded as her battlegroup penetrated defenses that had seemed impregnable moments before.
Maximum firepower, coordinated strike. The combined assault struck the Devourer command vessel at its heart, quantum disruptors tearing apart the technological matrix that controlled the entire swarm.
For a moment, space itself seemed to convulse as alien science collided with human innovation.
Then, the command vessel began to collapse, its destruction sending cascading failures throughout the Devourer fleet. Enemy vessels that had moved with perfect coordination suddenly began operating independently, their tactical effectiveness plummeting.
Constructs that had seemed invincible started showing vulnerabilities as their central control systems failed. The technological swarm that had consumed 17 civilizations began to fragment and retreat. The battle's aftermath was surreal. Where once there had been an unstoppable enemy fleet, now only wreckage remained floating in space. The Devourers hadn't been destroyed entirely, but their advance had been stopped and their forces scattered. For the first time since the war began, the galaxy had won a decisive victory. In the quiet that followed, Webb found himself on a secure channel with Admiral Chen and High Counselor Vexthera. The alien leader who had orchestrated humanity's expulsion 15 years earlier now faced the species she had dismissed as too dangerous for civilized society. "Your tactics were unexpected," Vexthera admitted, her crystalline form flickering with colors Webb had never seen before. "Our analysis suggests that without human intervention, this battle would have resulted in complete defeat for our combined forces." Chen's response was diplomatically neutral. Human forces were pleased to contribute to the defense of galactic civilization. "There will be other battles," Vexthera continued. "The Devourers have resources beyond our ability to calculate. They will adapt to the tactics used here, develop countermeasures to your technologies. This war is far from over." "Then, perhaps," Chen said carefully, "it would be beneficial for our forces to coordinate more closely. The Terran Federation has certain capabilities that complement assembly strengths. Working together, we might be able to develop strategies that neither of us could implement alone." It was a generous offer, given the history between their peoples. Webb watched Vexthera consider the implications, knowing that accepting would mean acknowledging humanity as an equal partner rather than a barely tolerated refugee species. The Assembly would welcome closer cooperation with Federation forces, the High Counselor finally replied. "Perhaps it is time to discuss more formal arrangements between our governments." Webb smiled, thinking of the long journey that had brought them to this point. 15 years ago, humanity had been cast out as too dangerous for galactic society. Today, they were being invited back as saviors of that same society. The species that had been exiled for their violence and unpredictability had proven that sometimes those very traits were exactly what survival required. The war against the Devourers would continue for years, testing the alliance between humanity and the Assembly in ways that no one could predict. But, in this moment, as human ships stood guard over the wreckage of enemy forces that had seemed invincible, Webb knew that something fundamental had changed. Humanity had built something greater in exile than they had ever achieved as supplicants. They had proven that independence and innovation could triumph over tradition and hierarchy. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that being cast out by civilization didn't mean abandoning it when it needed help. The galaxy was vast, full of threats and wonders that would challenge every species for millennia to come.
But, now humanity would face those challenges as equals, partners in shaping the future rather than dependents asking for permission to exist. It had taken 15 years of exile to build something worth fighting for. Now they would spend however long it took to ensure it survived.